Welcome! It's good to have you here. Let your day settle behind you now. There's nothing left that requires your attention. You can let it all go. Tonight, we're stepping into a different kind of cold. A January morning in 1820. The air sharp enough to burn the lungs, a stagecoach waiting in darkness outside a roadside inn, its leather sides already stiff with frost. A traveller climbs inside. The interior is dim and cramped, 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep. Wooden benches face each other across a space barely large enough for knees not to touch. There are no lamps, no source of heat. Only the thick wool blankets each passenger has brought, and the warmth that 9 bodies pressed together might eventually create. The door closes, the driver calls out above, the horses lean into their harness, and the coach lurches forward onto the frozen road. For the next 3 days, this small dark space will be home. There will be no true rest, only the constant rocking motion, the swaying that never stops, the cold that seeps through every layer, and the strange business could not wait indefinitely. Family emergencies, illness, death, births, occurred regardless of season. The young nation's economy depended on the continuous flow of people, goods, information, and currency between cities. Harvest proceeds needed to reach banks, legal documents required signing, property transfers demanded presence. And so people travelled in January, in February, through the months when doing so meant real suffering. This was not recreational. No one chose a winter stagecoach journey for pleasure. But necessity has its own logic, and in the decades between the 1780s and 1850s, the stagecoach was often the only option. Connecting roads in the early 1800s changed this calculation. These improved roads featured better drainage, more deliberate grading, and maintenance systems that included winter clearing in some areas. Not comfortable, but passable. The coaching companies advertised regular schedules year-round. This represented both promise and obligation. A scheduled departure meant the coach would leave whether conditions were favourable or not. Passengers who had purchased tickets and arranged their affairs around a specific departure date had little choice but to board even as snow fell or ice glazed the roads. Some travellers had more urgent reasons than others. A merchant might need to finalise contracts before a deadline. A lawyer might be required at a court session that would not be postponed. A son might receive word that his father was dying 2 states away. A woman might need to reach a sister in childbirth. These were the calculations that put people into stagecoaches in winter. The alternative to winter travel was waiting, weeks, sometimes months until conditions improved. For many, this was simply impossible. The work of the country had to continue. The coaching companies understood this and built their reputations on maintaining service regardless of weather. Drivers took pride in completing runs on schedule. Passengers, once committed, had to trust in this system. There was also the matter of mail. Stagecoaches carried US mail under contract, and these contracts specified frequency and skating surfaces, up mountain passes where ice formed in thick sheets. They did this because the alternative, a nation that paused for winter, was economically and politically unacceptable. Travellers knew what they were choosing. Accounts from the period make clear that winter journeys were understood to be ordeals. Diaries mention preparations, anxieties, advice sought from those who had survived similar trips. But they also reveal a certain resignation. If you needed to go, you went. The turnpike companies posted notices about winter conditions but rarely cancelled service. Drivers assessed situations but were under pressure to attempt routes. Passengers, having paid their fares and made their arrangements, were reluctant to forfeit money or delay plans. And so, on countless winter mornings between the Revolution and the coming of the railroads, people climbed into dark stagecoach interiors and committed themselves to days of cold, sleeplessness, and constant motion. This was how travel worked. This was what distance cost. The experienced traveller began preparations days before departure. Winter coaching required specific supplies. The coach itself would provide only motion and minimal shelter. Everything else, warmth, sustenance during delays, comfort of any kind, had to be brought aboard by the passengers themselves. Blankets were essential, not the light coverings used in summer, but heavy wool blankets, often multiple layers. Some travellers brought buffalo robes if they could afford them, or had access to frontier goods. These thick furred hides provided remarkable insulation and were prized possessions on winter routes. Foot warmers received particular attention. These were typically metal boxes with perforated lids designed to hold hot coals or heated stones. A traveller would arrange to have the foot warmer filled with coals just before departure, then refilled at each coaching in along the route. The warmth radiating from a foot warmer could make the difference between merely cold feet and frostbitten toes. Some passengers brought two, one for the feet, one for the lap. Clothing followed the principle of layers. A typical male passenger might wear linen shirt, waistcoat, wool jacket, heavy greatcoat extending past the knees, wool muffler wrapped multiple times around the neck, beaver hat, and both gloves and mittens. Wealthy travellers added fur-lined cloaks. Women wore multiple petticoats under heavy skirts, wool shawls over bodices, cloaks, bonnets lined with quilted fabric, and muffs for hands. The extremities demanded special care. Woolen stockings, sometimes 2 pairs, sturdy boots, extra stockings packed for changing if the first pair became damp from snow or perspiration. Ears could freeze quickly, so hats needed to cover them or separate ear coverings were necessary. Food provisions varied by passenger means and expectations. The coaching inns would provide meals, but delays were common in winter, and being stranded between stations with no food was a real possibility. Dried beef, hard cheese, apples, bread wrapped in cloth, and flasks of whiskey or rum were typical provisions. These were not for enjoyment, but for survival if the coach became stuck in a snowdrift miles from shelter. Booking the passage itself happened through coaching offices often located in taverns. The passenger gave their name, paid the fare, and received notification of the departure time. Winter fares were sometimes higher, not universally, but some routes charged premiums for the increased difficulty and slower speeds that meant more days of operation per journey. Advice circulated among travellers. Those who had survived winter journeys shared knowledge with those preparing for their first. Sit near the middle if possible, not by the door. Bring a cushion for the hard wooden bench. Don't drink too much liquid before departure, as there would be no privacy for bodily needs until the next inn. Position the foot warmer to warm the feet, but not so close that it might burn through stockings. Keep one blanket folded as a pillow, use the other for covering. The night before departure was often wakeful. Accounts mention anxiety, restless sleep, rising well before dawn to dress in the cold, dark of an inn room. Travellers typically stayed the night before at an inn near the coaching office to ensure they wouldn't miss the early departure. There was a mental preparation as well, a resignation to discomfort, an acceptance that the next several days would involve suffering that simply had to be endured. Letter writers and diarists describe this psychological shift, the conscious decision to view the journey as a temporary ordeal with a definite end point. Some drew on military service or other hardships they had survived. Others prayed. Women travelling alone faced additional concerns. The forced intimacy of the coach interior meant days pressed against male strangers. Propriety demanded certain behaviours, but the reality of the journey often broke down social niceties. Women were advised to travel with male relatives when possible, though many had no choice but to travel alone. Luggage had to be minimised. Space inside the coach was too precious. Most belongings were strapped to the roof, which meant they would arrive frozen and possibly damaged. Travellers packed one small bag for the interior, the foot warmer, the provisions, perhaps a change of stockings. Morning of departure arrived dark and cold. The coach would be waiting outside the inn, already loaded, horses stamping in the frozen air, breath visible in clouds, the driver checking harness and tackle by lantern light. Other passengers gathering in the inn's main room, similarly bundled, similarly anxious. And then the call, time to board. The vehicle that would serve as home for the next several days was not designed for comfort. It was designed to move mail, carry passengers, and survive roads that could barely be called roads at all. The interior measured approximately 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep, not much larger than a modern closet. Into this space, 6 passengers would fit on 2 bench seats facing each other, 3 people per bench, knees interlocking, shoulders touching. The ceiling was low enough that a tall person couldn't sit fully upright. Most passengers learn to tilt their heads slightly, or slump, or find some compromise between the two that their necks could sustain for hours. The seats themselves were simple wooden benches, sometimes with thin padding, more often without. Leather covered the wood in better coaches, bare planks in others. The backrest was nearly vertical, offering no recline, no adjustment, no mercy for the spine. Windows were not windows in the modern sense. They were openings in the coach body, roughly 2 feet square, cut into each side. In warm weather, these stayed open for air and light. In winter, leather curtains could be lowered and fastened to keep out wind and snow. But lowering the curtains created a new problem. The interior became dark, nearly completely dark during the night portions of the journey, and the air, sealed in with 6 breathing bodies, grew thick and stale within the first hour. So passengers faced a choice that had no good answer: freeze with the curtains up or suffocate slowly with them down. Most compromised. Curtains lowered most of the way, but not fastened completely at the bottom, allowing a thin stream of frigid air to flow across feet and ankles. The coach body hung suspended from a wooden frame by leather thorough braces. These were thick straps of layered leather, 4 to 6 inches wide, that ran the length of the coach on each side. They functioned like springs, absorbing some of the shock from the road, but they also created constant motion. The coach didn't simply roll forward, it swayed, it rocked. It pitched and dipped with every irregularity in the road surface. Passengers compared it to being at sea. That same queasy, unstable sensation of never being quite still. On a straight section of frozen road, the sway settled into a rhythm, almost hypnotic. Bodies learned to move with it, unconsciously shifting weight to compensate. But when the road turned, or climbed, or dropped into a rut, the motion became violent. Passengers were thrown against each other, against the walls, their heads knocking together in the darkness. The door was on one side only, a single hinged panel that opened outward. A leather strap served as a handle, no lock, no latch beyond a simple loop. The door fit imperfectly, leaving gaps where wind pushed through in thin, persistent streams. Above the passenger compartment, 3 more seats perched on the roof, wooden benches completely exposed to weather. A low iron railing provided something to grip, though it offered no real protection from falling. In summer, riding on top was preferable. Fresh air, open views, escape from the cramped interior. In winter, almost no one rode outside by choice. The position paid less, reflecting its hardship. Only the desperate or the destitute accepted it. They wrapped themselves in every piece of cloth they owned and endured. The driver sat at the front of the roof on a raised box seat that gave him view over the horses. He was completely exposed to wind, snow, and cold for the entire journey. No shelter, no relief. His survival depended on layers of wool, oiled canvas, and the constant movement required to manage 6 horses. The boot, a storage compartment at the rear of the coach, held luggage, mail pouches, and extra equipment. A second, smaller boot at the front held tools for emergency repairs. Both were leather-covered boxes, strapped and buckled closed. Passengers had no access to either while the coach was moving. No heating apparatus existed, no stove, no warming pan, no reservoir of hot coals built into the structure. The only heat came from human bodies pressed together in an enclosed space. This meant the temperature inside the coach hovered somewhere between the freezing air outside and the 98-degree warmth of skin. Perhaps 40 degrees, perhaps 35. Cold enough that breath formed visible clouds. Cold enough that fingers went numb after an hour. But not cold enough to freeze completely as long as the curtains stayed down and bodies stayed close. The floor was wood, sometimes covered with a thin straw mat that provided minimal insulation from the cold rising up from below. Feet resting on that floor grew numb first, then ankles. The cold crept upward through the body as the hours passed. The coach weighed between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds empty, with passengers, luggage and mail, perhaps 2,000 pounds total. This weight, distributed across 4 iron-rimmed wooden wheels, pressed down onto frozen roads with enough force to crack ice and compact snow. The wheels themselves were 4 to 5 feet in diameter, designed to roll over obstacles rather than through them. The rear wheels were slightly larger than the front, allowing sharper turns. Iron tires an inch thick provided durability but no cushioning. Every stone, every frozen rut, every patch of ice transmitted directly into the coach body through those unforgiving wheels. The entire vehicle was built to be repaired on the road. Bolts and straps, not welds or permanent joints. A broken thoroughbrace could be replaced in 30 minutes if the driver carried a spare. A cracked wheel took longer, but even that could be managed at a relay station with the right tools. This was the machine that would carry passengers through 3 days and nights of winter. A box of wood and leather, swaying on straps, sealed against the cold but never warm. moving forward without pause through darkness and daylight, through snow and ice, toward a destination that seemed impossibly distant in those first frozen hours. The schedule allowed no flexibility. The coach departed at the assigned hour, whether passengers were ready or not. In winter, departure times were usually set for 4 or 5 in the morning, early enough to maximize the limited daylight, late enough that horses could be harnessed and checked by lantern light without total chaos. Passengers gathered in the dim cold of pre-dawn, their breath-forming clouds in the frozen air outside the tavern or coaching inn. Luggage was loaded into the rear boot. Mail pouches, always given priority, went in first. Personal belongings fit around them if space allowed. The driver called for boarding. No ceremony, no assistance. Passengers climbed the single step and ducked through the low doorway into the interior that would hold them for the next 12 to 15 hours before the first long stop. Seating position mattered more than most people realized before their first journey. The 2 window seats, one on each side, were most desirable. They offered a view, ventilation, and something to lean against. The 2 corner positions on each bench next to the coach walls were nearly as good. The middle seat on each bench was misery. No window, no wall to lean against. Wedged between 2 other bodies with nothing but open air at your back. Worse, the middle seat on the backward-facing bench meant travelling in reverse, watching the landscape recede. A position almost guaranteed to trigger nausea within the first hour. Experienced travellers arrived early to claim better positions. Novices often ended up in the middle, learning through suffering what they would remember for next time. Once 6 bodies had arranged themselves, the door closed. The leather strap was fastened. The driver called to the horses and the coach lurched forward into motion. The first hour was the hardest. Bodies were not yet exhausted enough to ignore discomfort. The cold was sharp and aggressive, not yet the dull, familiar ache it would become. Every muscle was tense, braced against the motion, fighting the sway rather than moving with it. The air inside the coach was still fresh, which meant it was brutally cold. Breath froze in beards and on the wool scarves wrapped across faces. Frost began forming on the inside surface of the leather curtains within minutes, wherever warm breath made contact with the freezing material. The darkness was nearly complete. Dawn wouldn't arrive for another hour or more. If curtains were lowered against the cold, passengers sat in a blackness broken only by the faint grey glow from gaps around the edges, eyes adjusted barely. You could make out shapes, the silhouette of the person across from you, the outline of a hat, but no detail, no faces. Sound filled the void left by the absence of sight, the creak of leather thoroughbraces stretching and relaxing with each sway, the muffled thud of hooves in snow, a rhythm that was steady when the road was good, irregular when it was not, the grinding of iron wheel rims against frozen ground, the breathing of 5 strangers pressed close in the dark. No one spoke much in those first hours, partly because conversation required effort and everyone was cold and tense and focused on enduring, partly because speech felt like an intrusion into the shared misery. Silence was a kind of mutual respect. The motion was worst at the beginning before bodies learned to move with it. The coach rocked forward and back, side to side, in patterns that seemed random, but were actually the road surface translated directly into movement. A stone under the left front wheel became a sharp dip to the left. A frozen rut under the right rear wheel became a twist to the right a half-second later. Heads bobbed and knocked together, shoulders pressed and pushed, knees already interlocking by necessity, jabbed into the knees opposite with every lurch. Apologies were muttered in the first miles, then they stopped. There was no point. The jostling was constant and unavoidable. The cold settled in layers. Feet went numb first, pressed against the wooden floor or thin straw mat that provided almost no insulation, then ankles, then hands, even when tucked under arms or wrapped in muffs, noses and ears exposed to the thin stream of air leaking around the curtain edges, stung and then went dull. Core body warmth remained, at least in those early hours. 6 people in a sealed box generated heat, not enough to be comfortable, but enough to keep the interior temperature above freezing, enough to survive. As the sun began to rise, grey light filtered through gaps in the curtains. Not enough to read by, not enough to see clearly, but enough to make out faces across the narrow space. Enough to see the frost on wool, the red noses, the exhausted eyes of people who had not yet learned that this was only the beginning. The landscape outside, visible in brief glimpses when wind lifted a curtain edge, was emptiness. Snow-covered fields, bare trees, the road stretching ahead and behind, marked by the parallel ruts of previous coaches, frozen now into hard ridges. No houses, no movement, nothing but the white expanse and the grey sky, and the knowledge that this scene would not change for hours. Miles and miles of the same frozen world rolling past at 8 miles per hour, while inside the swaying box 6 people tried to find positions that hurt less, tried to warm frozen feet, tried to accept that comfort was not coming, and endurance was the only option. The driver, invisible above, called occasionally to the horses. His voice was muffled by wind and the coach roof, but passengers could hear the tone, steady, practiced, a man doing a job he had done 100 times before, guiding animals through cold he had long since stopped thinking about, following a route he knew by memory, even in darkness. Inside, the shared silence continued. Bodies shifted and resettled. Someone coughed. Someone else adjusted a blanket. The coach rocked on through the early morning, through the cold, through the empty landscape, and the rhythm of motion began its slow work of breaking down resistance, teaching passengers that fighting the discomfort only made it worse, and that the only way through was acceptance. The stagecoach was never still. Even when horses maintained steady pace on straight road, the vehicle rocked. The leather thoroughbraces suspended the coach body like a cradle, creating perpetual movement in every direction, forward momentum combined with lateral sway and vertical bounce. A passenger sitting inside experienced all 3 simultaneously without pause for hours that stretched into days. Period travellers compared the sensation to being at sea. The comparison was apt. Bodies moved in relation to each other and to the coach walls in ways that required constant small adjustments. A passenger might brace against the side panel for stability, but the next lurch would shift weight forward or sideways. What felt secure one moment became precarious the next. No position remained comfortable for long. Sitting upright with back straight created neck strain within an hour. The constant bobbing made it impossible to hold the head steady. Passengers who attempted to maintain formal posture through the early miles eventually surrendered, letting their bodies slump into whatever arrangement the motion dictated. Spines curved, shoulders rolled forward, heads drooped or lolled to one side. The wedging of bodies against strangers became both necessity and source of modest warmth. 6 or 7 people compressed into a space designed for comfort of perhaps 4 created a density that eliminated personal boundaries. Shoulders pressed together, hips touched, thighs made contact through layers of wool and coat fabric. This proximity was acknowledged silently, mentioned in letters home with embarrassment or resignation, but endured without complaint during the journey itself, because complaint would change nothing. The middle seat presented particular misery. This position, facing backward with no wall support, offered the least stability. Passengers here swayed more dramatically with each movement of the coach. The backward-facing orientation meant seeing the landscape recede rather than approach, which created a disconnect between visual information and physical sensation. Many travellers in this position experienced nausea, a motion sickness that added to existing discomfort. Those in middle seats had nothing to brace against except their fellow passengers. They learned to press feet against the floor and use leg muscles to maintain balance, but this created fatigue in thighs and calves within hours. Some leaned against the person beside them, creating chains of mutual support, where 3 passengers propped each other up in shifting configurations as the coach swayed. Heads bobbed and knocked together. When passengers attempted sleep, their heads became untethered. A sleeping person lost the constant small corrections that kept skull from striking neighbour or window frame. Other passengers learned to anticipate this. They positioned themselves to minimize collision, angling shoulders to create buffers, or accepted the occasional knock as simply another element of the journey's unpleasantness. The rhythm of hoofbeats and wheel rotation created patterns that became hypnotic. 4 horses at trot produced a complex percussion, 16 hooves striking frozen ground in sequence, wheels grinding over packed snow or ice with their own steady sound. When road surface remained consistent and horses maintained even pace, this rhythm could lull passengers toward drowsiness despite discomfort. But the rhythm broke constantly. A rough patch of road jolted everyone alert. A steep descent changed the angle of bodies and required renewed bracing. Turns shifted weight to one side, pressing passengers against each other with increased force. Each disruption reset whatever small comfort had been achieved, requiring passengers to find stability again from the beginning. The impossibility of stillness created exhaustion separate from lack of sleep. Muscles worked continuously to maintain balance and protect against impact. Necks strained, backs ached, even hands grew tired from gripping seat edges or coat fabric or the leather strap hung from the ceiling. For exactly this purpose, passengers shifted positions every few minutes in futile search for relief. Someone would lift their hip to relieve pressure on one side, creating a chain reaction as others adjusted to the new configuration. Another would attempt to stretch legs into the small floor space, forcing neighbours to rearrange their own feet. These constant small movements became a kind of slow dance, wordless negotiation of shared space in motion. The cold made stillness even less possible. When a foot or hand grew numb from maintained position, the passenger had to move it to restore circulation. Fingers flexed inside gloves, toes wiggled inside boots. Arms that had been pressed against torso for warmth needed periodic extension despite the cold because the alternative was cramping. Some passengers gave up trying to find comfort and instead entered a state of passive endurance. They let their bodies move with the coach rather than resisting, becoming part of the swaying motion instead of fighting against it. This acceptance didn't create comfort, but it reduced the constant tension of trying to remain stable. The swaying continued through darkness, through stops, through every hour of the journey. Even during the brief halts at coaching inns, the memory of motion persisted. Passengers, standing on solid ground, reported feeling as though they still moved, their bodies convinced the swaying would resume, and it always did. The door closed, the driver called to the horses, and the rocking began again, bodies wedged back into their compressed arrangement. Heads found positions against shoulders or window frames, or simply bobbed loose in the dark. The rhythm of hooves and wheels resumed, and the miles ahead stretched empty and swaying, offering no promise of stillness until journey's end. Warmth began with layers. No single coat provided adequate protection. Travellers wore multiple garments in succession, creating thickness that trapped body heat between fabric layers. A shirt, a waistcoat, a jacket, an overcoat, sometimes a second overcoat over the first. Women added shawls wrapped around shoulders and crossed over chest, then pinned to prevent slipping. More shawls covered heads and wound around necks, leaving only eyes exposed to freezing air. The innermost layers stayed driest. Outer layers collected moisture from breath and occasional snow, but the clothing closest to skin remained protected by the buffer of fabric above it. This was critical. Wet wool lost much of its insulating capacity. Experienced travellers knew to preserve the dryness of inner garments, even if outer coats grew damp or frosted. Hands required particular attention. Gloves alone provided insufficient protection during long exposure. Some passengers kept hands tucked inside coat fronts, arms crossed over chest. Others sat on their hands, using body weight to press them against the slight warmth of the seat. The most prepared travellers brought muffs, cylindrical fabric tubes lined with fur, large enough for both hands to enter from opposite ends and meet in the middle. But feet presented the greatest challenge. Boots insulated only minimally. The leather stiffened in cold, conducting temperature from frozen ground up through soles. Wool stockings helped, but not enough. Feet grew numb first, then painful as circulation struggled. Without intervention, frostbite became a genuine risk during journeys lasting days. This was why foot warmers were essential. These devices were simple. Metal boxes, roughly 6 inches square, with perforated lids to allow heat escape while containing coals or heated stones inside. Some had wooden frames to prevent direct contact with fabric or flesh. Others were simply wrapped in layers of flannel or burlap before being placed on the coach floor. A properly filled foot warmer provided warmth for 2 to 3 hours. Passengers positioned their boots on or near it, absorbing heat through boot soles. The warmth radiated upward through feet and legs, making the difference between bearable discomfort and genuine suffering. The warming process was gradual and precious. Cold feet began to tingle as sensation returned. The heat spread slowly through toes, then arches, then ankles. For those first minutes after placing feet on a freshly heated warmer, passengers experienced something approaching comfort, despite every other hardship. But the warmth was temporary. As hours passed, the coals cooled, or the stones lost their heat. The warmth diminished gradually until passengers realized their feet had grown cold again. They endured this returning chill until the next coaching stop, where foot warmers could be refilled or exchanged for fresh ones. This cycle repeated throughout the journey: warmth, slow cooling, cold, then brief renewal at the next inn. Some travellers brought additional heating sources. Heated bricks wrapped in flannel served similar purpose to foot warmers but retained heat differently. Stone cooled slowly and steadily. Brick sometimes held warmth longer, sometimes less, depending on how thoroughly it had been heated at the inn fireplace. These bricks were placed on laps rather than floors, warming hands and core. Passengers cradled them like precious objects, shifting position occasionally to expose different surfaces to their palms, extracting every degree of available heat before the brick became merely another cold object to carry. Blankets created another layer of defense. Heavy wool blankets or buffalo robes were shared among passengers, spread across laps and legs, sometimes pulled up to shoulders. Buffalo robes were particularly valued. Thick fur that blocked wind penetrating through leather curtains and retained heat better than woven fabric. A coach carrying such robes became noticeably warmer than one without them. The sharing required cooperation. A blanket large enough to cover 3 passengers' legs needed to be positioned carefully and held in place by mutual agreement. If one passenger shifted and dislodged the covering, cold air rushed in, defeating the purpose. Passengers learned to move minimally once the blanket was arranged, sacrificing comfort of position for preservation of warmth. Strategic positioning of bodies also mattered. Larger passengers generated more heat. When possible, these travellers took seats at the edges, near windows where cold penetrated most severely. Smaller passengers, women, children, slighter men, sat between them, benefiting from heat radiating from both sides. This arrangement was sometimes discussed openly, sometimes simply happened through unspoken understanding as passengers arranged themselves at the journey's start. The communal warmth of pressed bodies became significant as hours passed. Contact that seemed invasive in early miles became appreciated once deep cold set in. The heat of a stranger's shoulder against one's own, the warmth of a neighbouring thigh pressed close. These points of contact made measurable difference when exterior temperature dropped well below freezing. Some passengers brought additional scarves specifically for wrapping around faces during the coldest hours. Breathing through wool warmed the air slightly before it entered lungs and prevented direct exposure of cheeks and nose to wind. The fabric grew damp from breath moisture and eventually frosted, but it still provided protection against the worst of the cold. None of these strategies created actual warmth. They only slowed heat loss, reducing the rate at which body temperature declined. Passengers remained cold throughout the journey. The measures they took simply kept that cold from becoming dangerous, maintaining the narrow margin between discomfort and harm. The small triumph was this: a foot warmer freshly filled with hot coals, a buffalo robe arranged across 3 sets of knees, wool layers insulating skin from direct exposure, and the body heat of strangers pressed close in the dark. Not warm, but warm enough to endure until the next coaching in, and the next, through all the frozen miles ahead. True sleep was not something that happened inside a winter stagecoach. Rest came instead in fragments, in half-states, in moments when consciousness dimmed without disappearing entirely, when the body found something close to relaxation without ever fully surrendering to it. A passenger might close their eyes and feel themselves drifting. The rocking motion became a rhythm. The cold became familiar. The discomfort of the wooden seat, the pressure of shoulders on either side, the constant vibration through the floorboards, all of it faded slightly, not gone, but less immediate. The mind wandered towards something that resembled sleep. Then a wheel struck a frozen rut. The coach lurched, heads knocked together, bodies tensed, the moment shattered, and everyone was awake again, blinking in the darkness, readjusting position, starting over. This happened throughout the night, again and again. The best rest came during rare stretches of straight, smooth road. When the turnpike had been well maintained and the snow had packed down evenly, the coach found a steady rhythm. The swaying became predictable. The jolting stopped. For 10 minutes, perhaps 15, the motion was almost gentle. Heads drooped, breathing deepened. Passengers slumped against each other without resistance. These were the golden minutes of winter coach travel. Not sleep exactly, but something the body accepted as a substitute. Experienced travellers recognized these periods immediately. They knew certain sections of road between Philadelphia and New York, between Boston and Providence, where the surface stayed reliably smooth even in winter. They closed their eyes the moment the coach entered these stretches. They didn't waste the opportunity on conversation or shifting position. They took what rest the road would give them. But even on smooth road, true unconsciousness remained elusive. Some part of the mind stayed alert. The body never fully relaxed. Muscles remained braced, even while dozing, because the next jolt was always coming. A passenger learned to sleep the way a sailor slept in a hammock, with one part of awareness still monitoring motion, still prepared. This half-sleep produced strange dreams, brief and vivid. Passengers described dreaming they were at sea or falling or walking through snow that never ended. The dreams matched the motion of the body. When the coach swayed, the dream self swayed. When the wheels rumbled over a bridge, the sound entered the dream as thunder or drums or footsteps. The line between waking and sleeping blurred. A passenger might open their eyes and not be certain whether they had been asleep or merely thinking with eyes closed. Time behaved oddly in this state. An hour might pass that felt like 10 minutes. 10 minutes might stretch into what seemed like hours. The communal nature of the space meant that rest was never truly individual. One person's restlessness affected everyone. When a passenger shifted position, the movement travelled through the interconnected bodies. When someone coughed, everyone stirred. When a passenger near the window adjusted the leather curtain to check their location, cold air rushed in and ended whatever drowsiness others had achieved. Snoring presented a particular challenge. In the close quarters, even quiet snoring became loud. The sound mixed with the creak of leather and wood, creating a rhythm that some found hypnotic and others found maddening. But complaining was pointless. The snorer couldn't help it, and waking them only delayed the inevitable resumption. The middle seats, those facing backward, made rest even harder. The motion worked against the body's orientation. The swaying that might lull a forward-facing passenger to drowsiness created nausea in those facing the rear. They fought. Both sleeplessness and motion sickness caught in a miserable combination that made the night feel endless. Children, when they travelled, often managed real sleep. Their smaller bodies fit more easily into available spaces. They could curl up on a parent's lap or wedge themselves into corners that adults couldn't access. They slept with the enviable completeness of the young, heads lolling, mouths open, oblivious to discomfort that kept their elders awake. Adults watched them with something between envy and relief. At least someone was resting. The hours between midnight and dawn were the hardest. The cold deepened, energy flagged. The foot warmers that had provided comfort earlier grew cool, the body's reserves depleted. This was when passengers entered their deepest states of exhaustion, not sleep, but a kind of suspended endurance where time seemed to stop moving forward. Some travellers described this period as almost trance-like. The mind emptied, thoughts became simple. The whole world contracted to the immediate sensations: cold, pressure, motion, darkness. Nothing else existed. Past and future disappeared. There was only the present moment stretching on and on. Others found this the worst part of the journey. The inability to sleep despite overwhelming tiredness created a special kind of torture. They wanted desperately to escape consciousness, to make the hours pass faster, but their bodies refused the mercy of unconsciousness. Morning eventually came. Light began filtering through gaps in the leather curtains. The quality of darkness changed from absolute black to dark grey. Passengers who had been dozing stirred. Those who had been awake the whole time felt the night finally releasing its grip. No one woke refreshed. Rest had been too fragmentary, too shallow. Bodies were stiff, minds were foggy, eyes felt gritty and dry, but daylight itself provided a kind of relief. The night was over. They had endured it. The question of sleep would begin again the following night, and if the journey continued for 3 or 4 days, every night thereafter. The body never adapted enough to make it comfortable. It only learned to survive it. The interior of a winter stagecoach created a sensory environment unlike anything passengers experienced elsewhere in their lives. Darkness came first. When the leather curtains were drawn against the cold, the space became nearly black. Moonlight sometimes penetrated through gaps where the curtain edges didn't quite meet the frame, creating thin lines of pale blue-white light that moved across faces and hands as the coach swayed. On cloudy nights, even this disappeared. Passengers existed in a darkness so complete that they couldn't see the person pressed against them. This darkness changed how the other senses worked. Hearing became sharper. Touch became the primary way of understanding space. The lack of visual reference made the motion feel more extreme, the swaying more pronounced. The smell inside the coach was particular and inescapable. Wet wool dominated, the heavy, lanolin-rich scent of damp woolen coats, blankets, and scarves. This mixed with the leather smell of the seats and curtains, a sharper note that never faded. Underneath was the smell of bodies, sweat, breath, unwashed skin, the faint sourness of clothing worn for days. Horse smell drifted up through the floorboards, not unpleasant exactly, but constant. The warm, grassy scent of horse sweat and manure. On certain stretches of road, when the team worked hard pulling through deep snow or up steep hills, the smell grew stronger. These odours combined into something distinct. Years later, former passengers reported that certain smells, wet wool, leather, horses, could instantly transport them back to winter coach journeys. The scent memory was that strong. Sound filled the space constantly. The creak of leather was ever present. The thoroughbraces that suspended the coach body stretched and groaned with every movement. The sound was rhythmic but never quite regular. It changed pitch depending on the weight distribution of passengers, the condition of the road, the speed of travel. Wood creaked too. The coach frame flexed and settled. Joints that had been tight when the coach was new had loosened over years of use. Every component had its own voice. The door had a particular squeak. The roof beams had a low groan. The floorboards had a higher-pitched creak that came when someone shifted weight. The wheels produced a constant rumble. On frozen dirt roads, this was a steady, grinding sound. On corduroy roads, logs laid crosswise, it became a rhythmic thumping. On rare stretches of plank road, the sound grew smoother but louder. On ice, the wheels sometimes produced a high, singing note that set teeth on edge. Hoofbeats provided a 4-part rhythm. 4 horses, 4 sets of hooves striking the ground in a pattern that experienced passengers could read like a language. When the rhythm was steady and quick, the road was good. When it slowed and became irregular, the team was struggling through difficult terrain. When it stopped entirely, something was wrong. Human sounds layered over this mechanical symphony. Breathing was surprisingly loud in the confined space. 9 people breathing created a constant susurration. Some breathed through their noses with a faint whistle. Others breathed through their mouths, especially when cold air made nasal breathing painful. Snoring came and went as passengers drifted into and out of shallow sleep. Coughing punctuated the night. The cold air irritated throats and lungs. People cleared their throats, sniffed, occasionally groaned when the coach hit a particularly bad jolt. Conversation happened in fits and starts. Sometimes passengers talked in low voices, sharing information about themselves, about road conditions ahead, about the weather. Sometimes silence prevailed for hours, everyone too tired or too cold for speech. The darkness made conversation easier in some ways. The lack of eye contact removed a layer of social pressure, but harder in others, as speakers couldn't read facial expressions to know if their words were welcome. Touch was unavoidable. Bodies pressed together. Shoulders, hips, thighs in constant contact. Hands sometimes brushed when people adjusted blankets or shifted position. Feet tangled on the floor. Heads knocked together when the coach lurched. The quality of this contact changed over hours. At first, passengers maintained careful awareness of boundaries, apologizing for accidental contact, trying to minimize intrusion into others' space. As exhaustion set in and cold deepened, these formalities faded. Bodies leaned without apology. People shared warmth without asking permission. The distinctions between one person and another began to blur. The cold itself had a particular quality, not the sharp, clean cold of being outside in winter air, but a penetrating, persistent cold that worked its way through layers of wool and leather. It found gaps in clothing. It collected in the footwell where drafts came up through the floorboards. It radiated from the walls of the coach, where metal components conducted the outside temperature inward. Breath froze in moustaches and beards, creating a coating of ice that men had to periodically brush away. Breath froze on scarves wrapped around faces. The moisture from breathing condensed on the inside of the leather curtains, forming frost patterns visible when dawn light finally came. Hands and feet went numb first, then ears and noses. Then the cold worked deeper into core muscles, creating an ache that no amount of layering fully prevented. The rocking motion was constant and irregular. The coach swayed side to side on the leather thoroughbraces. It pitched forward and back when the road surface changed. It lurched suddenly when wheels hit obstacles. The motion was never smooth enough to be soothing, but never violent enough to prevent the body from adapting to it. This motion entered the body. It became part of how passengers perceived space. The stable world outside reduced to a moving, swaying environment where nothing was fixed. This created a peculiar disorientation. The coach became the only reality. The landscape outside, invisible in darkness, ceased to seem real. Taste was limited but specific, the taste of cold air, the metallic taste that sometimes came from breathing deeply in freezing temperatures, the lingering taste of whatever had been eaten at the last coaching in. The taste of fear during dangerous moments, the taste of one's own breath, stale and sour after hours without water or fresh air. All of these sensory elements combined into an experience that passengers struggled to describe to people who hadn't lived it. Letters home often failed to capture it. The darkness, the smell, the cold, the constant motion, the press of strange bodies, these created something more than the sum of parts. They created a complete sensory world, strange and uncomfortable, but also oddly absorbing, that filled consciousness so completely that nothing else could enter. The stagecoach did not travel with the same horses from beginning to end. Every 10 to 15 miles, the vehicle pulled into a relay station where a fresh team waited in harness, stamping and breathing clouds of vapour into the frozen air. The changeover happened quickly. Drivers knew the procedure by heart and worked with minimal conversation, unhitching tired animals and leading them away while new horses were backed into position and secured. Passengers remained inside during these brief stops, feeling the coach rock as the team was switched, hearing the clink of metal and the short commands of stable hands. The relay system formed the backbone of reliable coach travel. Without it, no team could have maintained speed over long distances, particularly in winter when snow and ice made every mile harder work. The horses that had just pulled the coach for their segment would rest, be fed, and wait their turn to work the route again when the next coach came through. The system ran in both directions simultaneously, with coaches passing each other on the road and using the same stations in opposite rhythms. In winter, these relay stations became even more critical. Deep snow, tired horses faster. Icy roads required more cautious progress, which paradoxically demanded more sustained effort from the animals to maintain even reduced speeds. A team that might comfortably pull a coach 15 miles in summer might need replacement after 10 in January. Station masters adjusted their rotations accordingly, keeping extra teams ready during the hardest months. The stations themselves were simple structures, often just a stable with an attached keeper's dwelling. They were not inns, offered no refreshment for passengers, and existed solely to service the relay system. The keeper lived there year-round in isolation, his schedule dictated entirely by the coach timetable. He knew to the minute when teams needed to be ready, and in winter that often meant rising in darkness to prepare horses for a coach that would arrive before dawn. Passengers experienced these relay stops as brief interruptions in the journey's rhythm. The motion ceased. Voices carried from outside, muffled by leather curtains and falling snow. The coach swayed as men worked around it. Then came the lurch as new horses leaned into harness, the crack of the whip, and motion resumed. The entire process rarely took more than 5 or 10 minutes. These stops did not provide relief from the cold. If anything, they made passengers more aware of it. While moving, the coach generated its own small ecosystem of trapped body heat and shared warmth. When stationary, that fragile equilibrium broke. Cold seeped in faster. The brief stillness allowed stiffness to settle into joints and muscles. Passengers sometimes shifted positions during relay stops, trying to ease cramped limbs, but the pause was never long enough for true comfort. The relay system required enormous coordination. Each station needed to maintain horses, feed, stable space, and a keeper on constant duty. The animals themselves represented significant investment. A coaching company might own or contract with dozens of relay stations along a single route, with multiple teams at each location to serve as coaches running in both directions. In winter, the costs increased. More feed for working horses, more frequent replacements for teams exhausted by difficult conditions, higher wages to convince keepers to endure isolated stations through months of bitter weather. The precision of the system was remarkable. Coaches were expected to maintain schedules despite weather, and relay stations made that possible. A coach delayed by snow on one segment could make up time on the next if fresh horses were ready exactly when needed. Station keepers developed an acute sense of timing, often stepping outside minutes before a coach was due, listening for the sound of hooves and wheels approaching through the winter silence. The horses themselves became specialized to their work. Teams learned their segments of road, knew the hills and turns, understood the rhythm of their labor. A horse that worked the same 10-mile stretch repeatedly developed knowledge that made the driver's job easier. In darkness or heavy snow, drivers sometimes trusted their team's familiarity with the route more than their own vision. Between relay stops and full coaching inns, passengers existed in a state of suspension, too short a time to truly rest, too long to remain comfortable. They counted the stops, measuring progress not in miles but in horse changes. 3 relays meant 30 to 45 miles covered. 5 meant they were approaching the next inn where they could finally exit the coach, stand upright, feel warmth. The system continued year-round without pause. Christmas Day saw the same relays, the same schedule, the same tired teams being swapped for fresh ones. Station keepers spent holidays alone except for the brief moments when coaches arrived, exchanged teams, and departed again into the frozen landscape. The work was invisible to most passengers, noticed only when something went wrong. A team not ready, a delay, a broken harness discovered during changeover. In heavy snow, relay stations sometimes became emergency refuges. If conditions ahead were impassable, a coach might wait hours at a relay station for the road to be cleared or weather to improve. The keeper's small dwelling would fill with cold, frustrated passengers, bodies packed into a space meant for one person's solitary residence. But these delays were rare. More often, the relay system functioned exactly as designed, and passengers experienced it only as a brief pause, a moment of stillness before the journey continued. The coaching inn appeared as a constellation of lit windows against the darkness, a promise of warmth that passengers had been anticipating for miles. The driver's horn sounded as the coach approached, a signal that carried through cold air with sharp clarity. Inside the vehicle, bodies stirred. Passengers who had drifted into half-sleep roused themselves. Those who had been awake for hours felt a surge of relief that bordered on emotion. When the coach halted and the door opened, the transition was almost violent. Freezing air rushed in, but it carried with it the scent of wood smoke and cooking food. Passengers extracted themselves from the cramped interior with difficulty, limbs stiff and uncooperative after hours of immobility. Some needed assistance to step down, bodies locked in sitting positions, legs uncertain about bearing weight. They stumbled toward the inn's entrance in a shuffling group, moving slowly, arms wrapped around themselves. The heat inside struck like a physical force. Large fireplaces at either end of the main room burned with fires built high and hot, fed constantly by inn servants who understood that warmth was what travellers craved above all else. The temperature difference between outside and inside was so extreme that it caused immediate discomfort. Faces flushed, eyes watered, fingers and toes began the painful process of thawing. Passengers jostled for positions near the hearths, the usual social courtesies suspended by desperate need for heat. The main room of a coaching inn in winter was a scene of controlled chaos. Multiple coaches might arrive within minutes of each other, their schedules coordinated to bring waves of cold, hungry travellers through the establishment. Inn staff moved with practiced efficiency, knowing they had perhaps 30 minutes to feed and warm each group before they had to return to their coaches. Long tables were already set with basic provisions, coffee and tea steamed in large pots, kept hot by the fire. Passengers ordered quickly, calling out requests to serving women who carried plates and mugs with a remarkable speed and minimal spillage despite the crowded room. The food was simple but hot, stew ladled from iron pots that hung over the fire, bread, cheese, slices of pie. Quality varied dramatically depending on the inn, but in winter, passengers cared more about temperature than taste. Hot liquid warming the body from the inside was the priority. Coffee, tea, rum, whiskey, anything that could speed the return of sensation to frozen extremities. The room was loud. Conversation competed with the crack and hiss of fires, the clatter of dishes, the scrape of chairs, the calls of staff and customers. Passengers who had maintained near silence for hours in the coach now spoke freely, the privacy of the dark interior replaced by the public space of the inn. Some exchanged information about conditions they had travelled through. Others asked inn staff about the road ahead, weather predictions, recent news. Local residents mixed with travellers, creating a temporary community that would dissolve when the coach horn signalled departure. At the hearth, foot warmers were refreshed. Passengers who had brought heated bricks or metal containers handed them to inn servants, who took them to the kitchen and returned them filled with fresh, hot coals or heated stones wrapped in cloth. This service was expected, part of the stop's purpose. Travellers rearranged their layers while warm, adding or removing scarves, adjusting coats, attempting to create more effective insulation for the next leg of the journey. The light inside coaching inns came from oil lamps and candles supplementing the firelight. In winter, with darkness arriving early and lingering late, coaches often arrived and departed in full night. The warm yellow glow of the inn contrasted absolutely with the blue-black darkness outside. Windows became mirrors reflecting the crowded room. Beyond the glass lay a landscape invisible and silent, existing only as an absence. The stops rarely lasted more than 30 minutes. Innkeepers knew the schedules and began clearing tables even as passengers ate. a polite but firm reminder that time was limited. Some travellers attempted to prolong their stay by ordering additional food or drink, but drivers adhered to timetables with inflexible determination. The horn would sound. The coach was ready. Passengers had to return whether they felt prepared or not. The social world of these inns created networks of information across the frozen landscape. A traveller heading north might share news from the south with someone heading in the opposite direction. Inn staff collected and distributed information as part of their function, telling arriving passengers what recent travellers had reported about conditions ahead: road washouts, fallen trees, ice on particular hills, taverns with especially bad food or good fires. All of this intelligence circulated through the coaching inn system. Passengers sometimes negotiated during these stops to rotate positions for the next segment of the journey. Someone who had endured the cramped middle seat might trade with another passenger who had enjoyed the relative comfort of a corner position. These arrangements required diplomacy and often the agreement of the entire coach, since any change affected everyone's comfort. The negotiations happened quickly, decided in the few minutes before departure. The inn provided the only true warmth passengers would experience during a winter journey. The coach itself offered no heat source. Once travellers left the inn and returned to the vehicle, they would not be truly warm again until the next stop, which might be hours away. This knowledge made departure harder. The contrast between the overheated room and the waiting coach was almost unbearable. Some passengers hesitated at the door, delaying until the last possible moment before stepping back into the cold. The blast of winter air when the inn door opened felt even more brutal after the heat inside. Passengers hurried across the small distance to the coach, heads down against the cold, clutching refreshed foot warmers and rearranged blankets. They climbed back into the cramped interior they'd been so grateful to escape 30 minutes earlier. The coach door closed. The driver's whip cracked. Motion resumed. Behind them, the inn returned to its cycle. Staff cleared tables completely, reset the room, prepared for the next wave of travellers. The fire was fed. Fresh pots of coffee and stew were readied. Within an hour, another coach would arrive and the same pattern would repeat, the inn existing as a fixed point of warmth and light in the continuous stream of winter travel. The stop rarely lasted more than 30 minutes, sometimes 20. The driver called the time from outside, and everyone knew it would not be extended. There was too much road ahead, too many schedules depending on this coach arriving when expected at the next major town. So everything that needed to happen had to happen quickly, in a specific order that experienced travellers had learned and newcomers discovered through awkward trial. First came warming. The fire took priority over everything else. Passengers arranged themselves in a rough hierarchy around the hearth, those who had secured the best positions inside the coach often maintaining their advantage here as well, standing closest to the flames while others hovered at the edges of the warmth. But the cold was a great equalizer. A merchant in fine wool and a farmer in rough homespun both leaned toward the same fire with the same desperation, their social distinctions temporarily suspended by shared need. The heat felt almost painful after hours in the freezing coach. Hands that had gone numb began to tingle and burn as circulation returned. Faces that had been tight with cold slowly relaxed. The warmth worked its way inward gradually, thawing outer layers first while the deep cold in bones and core remained for longer. A person could stand directly before a roaring fire and still feel frozen through the middle, the heat not yet having penetrated to where it was most needed. While bodies warmed, food was ordered. The meal was often included in the ticket price, though what that meant varied considerably from one inn to another. Stew appeared, most commonly, something that could be kept hot over the fire and served quickly to however many passengers arrived whenever the coach pulled in. Bread, sometimes fresh, sometimes not. Cheese, occasionally pie, though the quality of the filling was uncertain. The point was not excellence, but speed and heat, hot food, hot drink. Something to warm from the inside while the fire worked from the outside. Coffee and tea were requested frequently. Rum as well, mixed with hot water, sweetened if sugar was available. The warming effect of alcohol was temporary and somewhat illusory, but that didn't matter much when temporary was all that was available anyway. A person took warmth where they could find it, even knowing it wouldn't last past the next mile marker. Conversations formed quickly in these spaces. The coaching inn served as a node in a network of information that stretched across frozen landscapes. Local residents who gathered at the tavern brought news from their area. Travellers arriving from other directions carried reports about conditions on different routes. Passengers compared. Experiences shared warnings about difficult stretches ahead, offered advice about which inns provided better food or warmer fires at subsequent stops. A man who had travelled this route the previous week might mention that the bridge at Miller's Creek was partially iced over, requiring careful crossing. A woman arriving from the western route could report that snow had drifted badly through the Valley Pass, adding hours to that section. The inn's proprietor might know which relay stations had received fresh supplies recently and which were running low. This information flowed between people who would likely never meet again, shared freely because everyone understood that knowing what lay ahead made the journey marginally less dangerous. The driver sometimes came inside during these stops, though not always. When he did, he carried a particular authority. He knew the road better than anyone, had made this run dozens or hundreds of times, and his assessment of conditions ahead mattered more than anyone else's opinion. Passengers asked him questions about timing, about whether the weather might worsen, about how the horses were holding up. His answers were usually brief and factual, delivered while he ate quickly, knowing he would be back outside in the cold soon enough. While warmth and food were being secured, other necessary tasks proceeded. Foot warmers needed attention. The metal boxes that had provided precious warmth for the past hours were now cold, their coals long since turned to ash. Fresh coals were requested, or heated stones were prepared, wrapped in layers of flannel to prevent burns. This service cost extra at some inns, was included at others. Either way, securing a refreshed foot warmer was essential. The next leg of the journey would be bearable or unbearable, largely depending on whether feet could be kept from going completely numb. Layers were rearranged, scarves that had slipped were retied, gloves were checked for dampness from melted snow or frozen breath. Blankets were refolded to eliminate the wrinkles and bunches that had formed during hours of compression. These small adjustments made surprisingly large differences in comfort over the hours ahead. Some passengers used these minutes to step outside briefly, needing privacy for necessities that couldn't wait until the next stop. The privy behind the inn was usually a small wooden structure, unheated, nearly as cold as the open air. The visit was accomplished as quickly as possible, and returning to the warmth of the tavern room afterward felt like a small due salvation, even knowing it would only last a few more minutes. The social atmosphere in these spaces was peculiar. Strangers who would never normally speak to each other shared tables, shared information, shared the tacit understanding that they were all enduring the same ordeal. Class distinctions that governed behaviour in cities or towns relaxed somewhat in coaching inns, not disappearing entirely but becoming less rigid. A wealthy traveller and a labourer might not become friends, but they might share advice about managing the cold, might warn each other about a particularly bad section of road ahead, might acknowledge their shared experience with a nod or a brief comment about the weather. Children drew particular attention during these stops, especially in deep winter, when seeing a family willing to make such a journey was unusual. A mother travelling with a small child faced questions about her destination, expressions of concern, offers of extra blankets, or suggestions about how to keep the child warm. The shared understanding was that putting a child through this journey meant the reason for travel was serious indeed. Then the call came. Time to return to the coach. The driver's voice carried through the tavern room, and the brief island of warmth and light began to dissolve as passengers gathered their things. The transition from heated interior to frozen coach was managed differently by different people. Some rushed it, trying to minimize the shock. Others delayed until the last possible moment, stealing final seconds near the fire. The fire had done its work imperfectly. Outer layers were warm, sometimes almost hot. But that warmth was fragile, already beginning to fade even before stepping outside. And the core cold, the deep chill that had settled into bones and joints during the previous hours, hadn't fully disappeared. It had only retreated slightly, waiting. Stepping out of the inn and back into the January night felt worse than the original departure hours earlier. Then bodies had been rested, prepared as much as possible, braced for what was coming. Now they were tired, briefly warmed just enough to remember what comfort felt like, and facing the knowledge that many more hours remained before the next stop. The contrast made the cold feel sharper. The coach waited in the yard, fresh horses already hitched, their breath visible in clouds of steam lit by lanterns hanging from the inn's posts. The driver was back in position, checking harnesses, preparing for departure. Passengers approached the coach slowly, reluctantly, carrying their refreshed foot warmers and rearranged blankets, none of them eager to climb back into the dark interior that had become so familiar and so uncomfortable over the previous hours. The brief time inside the inn had allowed bodies to relax slightly, to unbend from the cramped positions they'd held for so long. Climbing back into the coach meant immediately resuming those positions, fitting back into the tight space, limbs folding into configurations dictated by the limited room and the presence of other bodies. The stiffness that had eased slightly returned instantly. Sometimes passengers negotiated position changes during these stops. A person who had endured the middle seat facing backward for the last leg might request a different spot, citing motion sickness or mounting discomfort. These negotiations were delicate, requiring careful attention to unstated hierarchies and sensitivities. A younger passenger might defer to an older one. A woman travelling alone might be offered a slightly better position by a gentleman attempting courtesy. Or positions might remain exactly as they had been, everyone simply reclaiming their established territory out of habit or resignation. The door closed. The brief connection to warmth and light severed completely. Darkness filled the coach interior again, broken only by whatever moonlight penetrated the leather window curtains. The temperature inside was shocking. Not just cold, but somehow colder feeling than it had been before the stop, though this was partly perception, partly the contrast with the heated tavern room still fresh in memory. The first minutes back on the road were often described in letters and diaries as the worst of the entire journey. Bodies that had briefly warmed now felt the cold twice as acutely. The foot warmers, freshly filled, provided blessed heat to feet and legs, but this only emphasized how cold everything else felt. Hands withdrew into coat sleeves, scarves were pulled higher, blankets were drawn tighter. Everyone hunched inward, trying to conserve whatever warmth remained from the fire. The coach lurched into motion and the swaying began again. The rhythm that had become almost hypnotic during the previous leg now felt jarring, unwelcome, a reminder that the ordeal was not over, but continuing. The creaking of leather and wood resumed. The sound of hooves and wheels on frozen ground filled the night. The sensation of movement through cold darkness, which had been briefly interrupted, picked up exactly where it had left off. For the first few minutes no one spoke. The silence was different from the companionable quiet that sometimes developed later in a journey. This was the silence of renewed suffering, of bodies and minds adjusting once more to discomfort, of the small private disappointment that the stop was over and the next one remained hours away. The warming process reversed itself quickly. The surface heat from the fire dissipated within minutes of departure. Outer layers that had been almost hot against skin cooled rapidly, then became neutral, then began to feel inadequate again. The core warmth lasted slightly longer, but it too faded, leaching away into the surrounding cold until bodies returned to the state they'd been in before the stop, not quite frozen, but thoroughly chilled, maintaining minimal warmth through layered clothing and shared proximity, but never approaching actual comfort. The food provided some internal warmth that lasted longer than the heat from the fire. A stomach full of hot stew generated its own small warmth that spread outward gradually. This was why experienced travellers prioritized hot food and drink during stops, even if they weren't particularly hungry. The calories mattered less than the heat they produced from the inside, a warming that couldn't be immediately stripped away by cold air the way surface warmth could. The fresh foot warmers made the most lasting difference. A properly prepared heated stone or box of coals, wrapped in enough layers of flannel, could provide warmth to feet and legs for 2 or 3 hours. This was long enough to carry a passenger most of the way to the next stop, though the heat diminished gradually, fading from actively warm to merely less cold, to finally just another cold object that happened to be sitting near one's feet. As bodies readjusted to the cold and the motion, the peculiar semi-conscious state that characterized long-distance coach travel began to reassert itself. Not quite awake, Not quite asleep, passengers drifted in darkness, braced against the swaying, wrapped in wool and leather, breathing air that tasted of cold and horse, and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from the inn they'd left behind. The rhythm of the journey resumed, hours of endurance, brief stops, reluctant returns to cold, more hours of endurance. Each cycle the same, each stop both relief and torment. Relief because it temporarily ended the immediate suffering, torment because it provided just enough comfort to make returning to discomfort harder. The moon continued across the sky, if it was visible at all through whatever clouds might be crossing the winter night. The landscape passed unseen in darkness. The miles accumulated slowly, and inside the coach passengers settled back into the patient endurance that was the only real strategy available to them, knowing that the journey would end eventually, but not yet. Not for many hours yet. The darkness changed the journey. When the sun set, which in January came early, sometimes as early as 4:30 in the afternoon, the world inside the coach contracted further. What little visual reference remained disappeared. The landscape outside became invisible except when the moon was full and the sky clear, and even then it appeared as an abstraction. White expanses of snow, black lines of fence posts, the skeletal shapes of bare trees moving past like shadows cast by no visible source. The moon on snow created light, but not the kind that helped. It was blue and cold, a reflected glow that made the winter landscape appear even more lifeless than it was. When passengers pulled back the leather curtains to look out, and most did periodically, needing some visual confirmation of the world beyond their cramped container, they saw a scene that resembled no daytime experience. The snow glowed faintly. The trees were black against it. Shadows fell in directions that seemed wrong, cast by moonlight. From an angle the mind didn't quite accept as natural. The light came and went, depending on clouds. Sometimes the coach travelled for an hour through complete darkness, the landscape invisible, existence reduced to motion and cold and the sounds of travel. Then the clouds would part, and suddenly the world reappeared in that strange blue-white glow, revealing hills and fields and forest that looked more like a dream of landscape than actual place. Inside the coach the darkness was nearly total. No lamps were lit. Passengers could see each other only as darker shapes against darkness, perhaps a glint of eye when moonlight briefly illuminated the interior through a gap in the curtains. Faces became invisible. People sitting inches apart could not see each other's expressions. The social world contracted to voices and touch, the pressure of a shoulder, the warmth of another body, the rustle of fabric as someone shifted position. The disorientation was profound. Time became impossible to track with any precision. Without visual reference, without the sun's movement to mark hours, passengers lost their sense of how long they had been travelling. Was it 9 o'clock or midnight? Had they been on the road for 3 hours since the last stop, or 5? The darkness stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Hours passed in what felt like minutes. Passengers who had pocket watches sometimes pulled them out and held them close to the window, waiting for moonlight to illuminate the face, desperate for some objective measurement of time's passage. The isolation was complete. During daylight hours, passengers could at least see occasional signs of human presence. A distant farmhouse, smoke from a chimney, fields that showed evidence of cultivation, even if covered now in snow. At night, all of that disappeared. The landscape felt empty in a way that daylight never quite conveyed. The coach moved through darkness as if it were the only human endeavour in an unpopulated world. Miles passed with no evidence of other people, no lights visible from houses, no other travellers on the road, nothing but the coach and the horses, and the endless frozen landscape rolling past unseen in the dark. Passengers understood intellectually that towns and farms existed out there, that they would reach another inn eventually, that this road was travelled regularly, but the darkness made such knowledge feel abstract. What they experienced was isolation, distance, the sense of being very small and very alone in a very large and very cold world. This was when trust became everything. The driver sat outside in even greater darkness, exposed to cold that passengers inside could barely imagine. He could not see the road in any conventional sense. On moonless nights, or when clouds covered the sky, he guided the horses through complete blackness, navigating by memory and feel and the horses' own sense of the road beneath them. Passengers inside had no choice but to trust him entirely. They could not see where they were going. They could not judge his decisions. They could only feel the coach moving forward and hope that the invisible man above knew what he was doing. The horses themselves became objects of trust. These animals pulled the coach through darkness over roads they might never have travelled before, following the driver's commands, feeling their way over ice and frozen ruts. When the road crossed a frozen stream and passengers could hear the change in sound as wheels moved from packed snow to ice, a different kind of creaking, a hollow sound that suggested water beneath, there was nothing to do but trust that the ice would hold, that the horses would find solid footing, that the coach would make it across. Some passengers found this trust terrifying, others found it oddly liberating. There was nothing they could control, no decisions to make, no way to see danger coming or to prepare for it. They could only sit in the dark and trust and wait. The darkness also erased social boundaries in ways that daylight did not. When passengers could not see each other clearly, when faces became invisible and only voices remained, the usual markers of social class became harder to maintain. A well-dressed merchant and a farmer looked the same in the dark. Fine fabric and rough wool both felt like cloth. Exhaustion affected everyone equally. The cold did not care about status or wealth or education. Conversations that might not have happened in daylight sometimes occurred in darkness. Strangers spoke more honestly when they could not see each other's faces. Confessions emerged. Stories were told. A man might mention fears he would never have voiced to a visible audience. A woman might speak of losses or hopes she normally kept private. The darkness created a strange intimacy, a confessional quality, as if the invisibility granted permission for honesty. Other passengers fell silent entirely, not from unfriendliness, but from a kind of exhausted peace. There was nothing to see, nothing to do, only the endless rocking motion and the cold and the darkness. Speech required effort. Silence was easier. And so the coach sometimes travelled for hours with barely a word exchanged, passengers lost in their own thoughts or in that half-conscious state between waking and sleeping that the motion and darkness encouraged. The sound of hooves and wheels became hypnotic in the darkness. During daylight, passengers had visual distractions, things to look at, changes in scenery to mark progress. At night, those distractions vanished. Only the sounds remained. The steady rhythm, when the road was smooth, the irregular clatter when it wasn't, the creak of leather and wood, the breathing of other passengers, the occasional cough or sigh. These sounds became the entire world. Passengers found themselves listening with an intensity that daylight didn't require. The change in rhythm when the road surface shifted. The particular sound that meant wheels were moving through deeper snow. The way the hoofbeats echoed differently when the coach passed through a hollow or near a hillside. Every sound carried information, and in the darkness, sound was all they had. The passing of trees created its own rhythm. When moonlight was sufficient, passengers could see the dark vertical lines of tree trunks passing in regular intervals along the roadside, one after another, like fence posts marking distance that couldn't otherwise be measured. Some passengers counted them, giving themselves something to do, some way to quantify the passage of time and space. Others watched them blur together into a continuous dark line, the individual trees disappearing into abstraction. When clouds covered the moon completely, even that reference disappeared. The world became nothing but motion in blackness. Some passengers closed their eyes, finding no difference between eyes open and eyes closed. Others kept their eyes open, staring into darkness, as if the act of looking might somehow create vision. Something shifted in the mind after enough hours. The journey had begun with a resistance. Bodies tensed against the cold, minds catalogued every discomfort. Passengers fought the experience even as they endured it. But resistance required energy, and energy depleted. After the first day, after the first night, after the return to darkness, following the second day's brief passage through light, resistance became impossible to maintain. What replaced it was acceptance, not happiness, not comfort, but a kind of mental surrender to the reality that this was simply what was happening and would continue to happen until the journey ended. Fighting it changed nothing. Complaining changed nothing. The cold would remain cold, the motion would continue, the hours would pass at their own pace, regardless of how passengers felt about it. And so, gradually, without quite deciding to, most passengers stopped fighting. This acceptance brought its own kind of peace. The discomfort remained. The cold still penetrated layers of wool, bodies still ached from immobility, but the mental suffering that came from resisting the discomfort began to ease. Passengers entered a state that was almost meditative, not peaceful in any positive sense, but quiet, empty, a kind of endurance that required less and less conscious effort as hours turned into days. Experienced travellers recognized this shift. They had felt it on previous journeys, this movement from active misery to passive endurance. They knew it was coming and sometimes even looked forward to it. The way a difficult task becomes easier once you stop dreading it and simply do it. First-time winter travellers usually resisted longer, but eventually they too felt the shift. Often, without recognizing it as such, they simply noticed at some point that they had stopped counting hours, stopped anticipating the next relay station, stopped thinking much about anything at all. The motion helped. The constant rocking, hour after hour, created a rhythm that the body eventually accepted rather than fought. Like being rocked as an infant, though without any comfort beyond the rhythm itself. The swaying became familiar, expected, almost soothing in its regularity, at least on stretches of road where it remained steady. Passengers found themselves moving with it rather than bracing against it, their bodies swaying in time with the coach's motion even when they didn't consciously choose to do so. Conversation changed as this acceptance deepened. Early in the journey, passengers had talked to pass time, to distract themselves from discomfort, to establish social connections that might make the forced intimacy less awkward. They exchanged information about their origins and destinations, their reasons for travel, observations about the weather and the roads and the quality of the coaching inn where they had last stopped. But as exhaustion accumulated and acceptance set in, these conversations died away. Not from hostility or even from lack of interest, but from a kind of shared understanding that speech was no longer necessary. Silence became easier than talking. Passengers sat inches apart, shoulders touching, sharing blankets, sharing warmth, sharing space, all without speaking for hours at a time. This silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people enduring something together, a shared experience that required no verbal acknowledgement because everyone was living it simultaneously. Like soldiers in a trench or sailors in a storm, the common hardship created its own form of communication, a shift in position to allow someone else more room, a blanket adjusted to cover another passenger's exposed shoulder, small acts of mutual care performed without discussion, without thanks, simply as what one did when sharing difficult circumstances with strangers. The intimacy was strange and complete. Under normal circumstances, the kind of physical closeness that the stagecoach required would have been deeply uncomfortable, a violation of social boundaries that governed interaction between strangers. Bodies did not touch. Personal space was maintained. Physical contact was reserved for family or very close friends, and even then it followed strict protocols. But the coach made such boundaries impossible to maintain. 9 people could not fit into 4 feet by 4 feet without touching, without leaning against each other, without knees pressing together and shoulders overlapping, and sometimes, when sleeping or half sleeping, heads resting on another passenger's shoulder or arm. The first day, this had been awkward. Passengers apologized for every contact, adjusted positions to minimize touch, maintained what boundaries they could through rigidity and careful placement of limbs. But such vigilance could not be sustained. Bodies needed rest, exhaustion overrode propriety, and gradually, sometimes within the first 24 hours, passengers simply stopped apologizing for what could not be avoided. The trust this required was profound, to let your head fall against a stranger's shoulder while dozing, to allow another passenger's weight to rest against you, to sleep, however briefly, however lightly, while pressed between people you had never met before climbing into this coach. It violated everything that social convention taught about appropriate interaction with strangers, and yet it happened. It had to happen. And in the happening, something shifted in how passengers related to one another. The formal barriers did not so much disappear as become irrelevant. A well-dressed merchant might find himself leaning against a farmer's shoulder. A woman of good family might doze with her head tipped back against the shoulder of a tradesman, and none of it mattered because comfort, even the tiny comfort of a supported head, mattered more than maintaining social distance. This democracy of suffering was one of the journey's strangest aspects. Wealth could purchase better clothing and more blankets, which helped, but it could not purchase warmth, it could not purchase more space inside the coach, it could not make the hours pass faster, or the road smoother, or the cold less penetrating. Rich and poor, educated and illiterate, respectable and questionable, all endured the same motion, the same cold, the same sleeplessness, the same endless hours. Some passengers found this levelling uncomfortable even as it happened. Social hierarchy was supposed to mean something. Status was supposed to provide advantages, but inside the coach, status provided almost nothing except perhaps slightly better fabric against your skin, and even that advantage disappeared under layers of whatever wool kept you warmest. Others found it strangely comforting. For a few days, the usual social calculations did not apply. No one was performing status. Everyone was simply trying to endure. A wealthy passenger might ask a poor one for advice about managing cold feet, and the advice would be given without awkwardness because experience with cold mattered more than income. A farmer might share his food with a merchant not out of deference but simple human kindness born from shared hardship. The journey stripped away performance. No one could maintain their best self for 3 days without sleep in freezing conditions. Pride broke down. Pretense became impossible. Passengers saw each other at their worst, unwashed, exhausted, sometimes in pain, often afraid. And this mutual vulnerability created connection that normal social interaction never produced. Letters and diaries sometimes mentioned this aspect of the journey with something like wonder. The recognition that they had shared greater intimacy with strangers in a stagecoach than with people they had known for years in normal life. That they had trusted these strangers with their physical safety, their comfort, sometimes their dignity, and that this trust had usually been honoured, not because the strangers were particularly virtuous, but because the circumstances demanded mutual care as the price of survival. Not every passenger experienced this transformation. Some remained rigid throughout the journey, maintaining whatever boundaries they could, enduring the experience in isolated misery, even while surrounded by others. But most, eventually, let go. Let their bodies rest against other bodies. Let their guard down. Let the shared suffering become shared endurance rather than individual ordeal. This was perhaps the journey's deepest lesson, though few articulated it at the time, that comfort and dignity and social performance were luxuries that required certain conditions to maintain. Remove those conditions, remove warmth, remove rest, remove space, remove time, and what remained was simpler. Bodies needing rest, people needing help. Strangers becoming temporary companions through nothing more than proximity and shared difficulty. The stagecoach in winter was many things, a vehicle, a trial, a necessity, but it was also accidentally a kind of social experiment, a demonstration of what happened when the usual structures fell away and humans had to simply endure together, relying on each other because there was no other choice. Most passengers were grateful when the journey ended, but some, looking back later, recognized that they had experienced something rare. A brief window when life was reduced to essentials, when pretense became impossible, when the only thing that mattered was getting through the next hour together. The memory was not pleasant, but it was powerful, and it changed, subtly, how they understood both hardship and connection. The stagecoach moved through darkness on roads that were never entirely safe. In winter, they became genuinely dangerous. Ice formed on slopes and corners, snow concealed ruts and stones, frozen streams had to be crossed where the ice might hold or might not. The risks were real, known to every passenger, and impossible to avoid. Drivers maintained schedules. Companies competed on reliability and speed. A driver who delayed for cautious reasons might lose his position to someone willing to push through. So they continued in conditions that reason suggested they should not. Passengers understood this. They knew the man above them balanced their safety against his livelihood, and that the balance did not always favour safety. The sound of ice cracking under wheels produced instant silence inside the coach. Conversation stopped. Bodies tensed. Everyone listened to the pattern of cracking sounds, trying to judge whether the ice would hold or give way. Crossing a frozen stream took perhaps 30 seconds. Those seconds stretched. The far bank always came as relief, though no one spoke of the fear that had just passed. On steep descents, the coach leaned forward. Passengers braced instinctively against the seat ahead or the walls. The driver's voice came from above, steady commands to the horses, urging them to hold back against the weight pushing from behind. The brake created a grinding sound. The smell of burning wood filtered into the coach as friction heated the mechanism. Everyone knew that if the brake failed, or the horses lost footing on ice, the coach would slide forward, out of control. It happened sometimes. Coaches overturned on winter roads with enough frequency that most travellers knew someone who had experienced it. The vehicle would tip, usually slowly at first, giving passengers a moment to realise what was occurring before the full impact. Bodies tumbled together, luggage fell. The sounds of splintering wood and screaming horses mixed with human cries. Injuries ranged from bruises to broken bones. Deaths occurred, though not commonly. The greatest danger came from being thrown clear and struck by the coach as it continued to roll, or from being dragged if clothing caught on something. After an overturn, passengers faced hours in the cold while the driver and any able-bodied men worked to right the vehicle or arrange rescue. This meant standing or sitting in snow, already exhausted, now shocked and often injured, while night deepened around them. The temperature that had been merely uncomfortable inside the moving coach became life-threatening in stillness. Getting stuck in deep snow happened more frequently than overturning. The coach would slow, then stop as wheels sank into a drift that appeared no different from the surrounding landscape. Everyone knew what came next. The driver would call down that passengers needed to exit and help push. This meant climbing out into wind and darkness, leaving behind even the minimal warmth of the coach and putting shoulders to freezing wood and iron. Men pushed. Women and children waited to the side unless the situation was desperate enough that all hands were needed. The work generated heat through exertion, but that heat turned immediately to chill when the coach finally broke free and passengers had to climb back inside with clothes dampened by snow and sweat. The cold after such effort felt worse than before. Wolves existed in the forests through which winter roads passed. They rarely approached roads or people, but passengers heard them sometimes. Distant howls carrying across frozen darkness. The sound produced an ancient fear that reason could not entirely dismiss. People told stories of coaches pursued, though such accounts were almost certainly exaggerated or invented. Still, the howls reminded travellers that they moved through a landscape not entirely tamed, where human presence was temporary and thin. The most persistent danger was simply the cold itself. Frostbite developed gradually. Toes and fingers went numb, then began to hurt, then stopped hurting. That final stage was the dangerous one. Passengers who removed their boots at journey's end sometimes found blackened toes that would later need amputation. Noses and ears suffered similarly. The injury accumulated silently while attention focused elsewhere. Drivers suffered worst from this. They sat exposed hour after hour, day after day. Their faces became weathered leather, lined deep, often scarred by frostbite from previous winters. They wrapped themselves in layers and fur, but the wind found every gap. Their hands, which had to maintain feeling to control the reins, endured constant, painful cold. It was understood that coaching was work that aged a man rapidly. Inside the coach, passengers could do little about these dangers except endure them and hope. They could not see the road ahead. They could not judge conditions. They trusted the driver's skill and the horse's instinct, and they accepted that winter travel meant accepting risk that could not be calculated or avoided. The acceptance itself became a kind of comfort. Once you recognized that danger existed and could not be prevented, worry became pointless. You either arrived safely or you did not. The outcome was beyond your control. This recognition brought a certain peace, or at least a resignation that resembled peace. After the initial hours of discomfort came a gradual process of adaptation. Bodies learned to brace against motion without conscious thought. Passengers discovered which positions caused the least pain and how long each position could be maintained before requiring change. Small adjustments, a folded coat behind the lower back, a scarf wadded against the window frame to cushion the head, made incremental differences that accumulated into something approaching tolerance. Experienced travellers possessed knowledge that could ease the journey. An older man might show a first-time passenger how to tuck hands inside the coat rather than keeping them in pockets, creating a warmer space against the body. Someone who had made the route before might warn when a particularly rough section approached, allowing others to brace properly. A woman familiar with winter travel might share the trick of breathing into cupped hands to warm them, then immediately tucking them back into layers before the warmth dissipated. This sharing of knowledge created small bonds. A whispered tip became an offering of kindness that cost nothing but might spare someone hours of unnecessary suffering. Recipients often passed the same knowledge forward on future journeys, creating an oral tradition of survival that moved through the coaching network like folklore. Finding comfort in another passenger's warmth required delicacy. Social conventions about physical contact remained strong, even in circumstances that forced bodies together. But gradually, as exhaustion deepened, a shoulder might lean slightly more heavily against a neighbour. If the neighbour did not shift away, the contact continued. This unstated permission allowed both parties to share warmth and provide mutual support against the coach's motion. No acknowledgement was made. Both passengers would look elsewhere, maintaining the fiction that the contact was accidental. Small children travelling with parents sometimes moved between passengers' laps as the journey progressed. A child might begin the trip with its mother, but after hours of restlessness, another passenger, perhaps a grandmother travelling alone or a merchant missing his own children, would offer to hold the child for a while. The break benefited everyone. The mother rested her arms. The child experienced a change that might settle its crying. The temporary caretaker felt useful and connected. Between the long stops at coaching inns, time became difficult to track. Without watches and with daylight obscured by leather curtains, passengers lost orientation. Someone might ask how long until the next stop, and receive only estimates in response. This temporal uncertainty created a strange suspension where the journey felt both endless and oddly timeless. Conversation helped pass the hours, but required energy that cold and sleeplessness depleted. Talk came in waves. After a stop, when passengers returned marginally refreshed, they might speak for an hour, discussing the quality of the meal, the condition of the horses, news heard from other travellers. Then silence would fall again as the warmth from the coaching inn faded, and discomfort reasserted itself. Some passengers told stories. A merchant might describe distant cities and strange customs encountered in his trade. A farmer might explain crop patterns and weather signs. These narratives required little response from listeners, making them well suited to the drowsy audience. The storyteller's voice became part of the journey's rhythm, rising and falling with the coach's motion. Others sang quietly. Hymns were common, their familiarity allowing multiple passengers to join without coordination. The singing served multiple purposes. It passed time, created community, and provided something to focus on besides cold and discomfort. Voices in the dark, slightly off-key, singing verses everyone had known since childhood. After many hours, a particular position might finally reveal itself as least uncomfortable. Perhaps sitting slightly sideways with one hip taking more weight than the other, head resting in a specific angle against the coach wall, one foot braced against the opposite seat. The position made no sense and could not be held long, but for 20 minutes it provided something close to comfort. That 20 minutes felt like victory. Dozing became its own skill. Full sleep remained impossible, but experienced travellers learned to enter a state of half-consciousness where time passed more quickly and awareness of discomfort dimmed. The key was surrendering to the motion rather than fighting it, letting the body rock without resistance, allowing the mind to drift without trying to maintain alertness. These brief periods of dozing accumulated across hours provided the only real rest the journey allowed. Small acts of courtesy took on outsized significance. A passenger who noticed another's blanket slipping and quietly adjusted it performed a meaningful service. Someone who suppressed a cough to avoid disturbing others demonstrated consideration that was noted and appreciated. Another, who shared a piece of bread or dried fruit from personal stores, created goodwill that made the cramped quarters slightly more bearable. The coach's interior, initially a prison of discomfort, gradually became familiar. Passengers learned its sounds and movements. They knew which creaks signalled normal operation and which suggested something amiss. They recognized the rhythm of good road versus bad. They developed, despite themselves, a strange habituation to conditions that remained objectively miserable. This adaptation was not comfort. The cold remained cold, the exhaustion remained exhausting, but the absolute shock of the initial hours faded into something more like steady endurance. The journey continued, and so did the passengers within it, finding what small easements they could while waiting for the destination that must eventually arrive. The driver endured what passengers did not see. While travellers pressed together inside the coach, wrapped in blankets and buffalo robes, sharing the meagre warmth of enclosed space, one man sat exposed on the box above. His position faced the full assault of winter wind. No walls blocked the cold, no roof stopped snow from settling on his shoulders and hat brim. He held the reins through thick gloves, leather sometimes stiffening in extreme cold until flexibility nearly vanished. These men knew every mile of their routes. They recognized landmarks invisible to passengers, a particular bend in the road, a distinctive tree, the shape of a hillside against the night sky. This knowledge meant safety. In darkness, when passengers inside could see nothing beyond occasional moonlit glimpses through curtain gaps, the driver guided horses along roads that disappeared under snow, trusting memory and the subtle feedback of rains to detect the packed surface beneath fresh powder. They called down updates periodically. A voice from above, muffled by wind and the coach roof, announced progress. 2 miles to the next station, rough patch ahead. All's well. These brief communications connected the isolated interior to the larger journey. Passengers who had drifted into anxious half-sleep would surface at the sound, reassured by the steady authority in that external voice. At relay stations, the driver descended stiff-legged, movements careful after hours of immobility in one position. He checked on passengers with the same attention he gave to horses and harness. Everyone managing? The question was practical, not social. He needed to know if anyone suffered from dangerous cold, if anyone required a longer stop, if conditions inside demanded adjustment. Sometimes he brought news, another coach seen heading the opposite direction, word of road conditions miles ahead, updates on weather brewing to the west. His exposed position made passenger complaints seem trivial. When someone inside grumbled about cold feet or cramped positions, the sight of the driver's frost-rimmed beard and ice-caked coat silenced further grievance. This man had been outside for every mile they had travelled inside. He would return to that position for every mile remaining. The profession demanded particular qualities, physical endurance certainly, the ability to sit exposed to winter weather for 10 or 12 hours with only brief, warming intervals, but also judgment. Drivers made constant decisions about pace, about whether to push through deteriorating conditions or wait, about which route to take when snow obscured the main road. Passengers entrusted their lives to these assessments. Somewhere past midnight, time lost its usual structure. The darkness inside the coach became complete when clouds covered the moon. Passengers could not see hands held before faces. The world contracted to sound and sensation, the creak of leather thoroughbraces, the muffled rhythm of hooves on snow-covered ground, the breathing of other travellers, the movement of the coach body swaying on its leather straps. In this sensory deprivation, consciousness changed. Passengers stopped fighting the discomfort. Resistance required energy that exhaustion had depleted. Bodies settled into whatever positions the cramped space allowed. Shoulders pressed against shoulders, heads drooped forward or tilted sideways, seeking support. The cold became simply present, no longer something to combat, but something to exist within. The rocking motion that had seemed intolerable in daylight hours transformed into something almost soothing. The rhythm, when the road ran smooth, became hypnotic. Forward, and back, side to side, the predictable pattern of movement replacing thought. Passengers drifted in states between waking and sleeping, never fully one or the other. A jolt from a frozen rut would surface them briefly, then the steady motion would pull them down again into dimness. Conversations that had sustained the early hours faded entirely. Words required effort. Silence held the coach interior, broken only by occasional coughs, the rustle of someone adjusting a blanket, a sleeper's unconscious murmur. This quiet was not uncomfortable. Strangers who had shared this space for hours no longer felt the need to fill emptiness with speech. The experience itself connected them beyond words. Time stretched and compressed. 5 minutes might feel like an hour. An hour might pass in what seemed like moments. Without visual reference points, without the usual markers of day, passengers lost their internal sense of duration. The journey became eternal and immediate simultaneously, always happening, never quite real. The sky began to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually over what might have been 30 minutes or an hour. Time had lost its usual shape. The absolute blackness behind the leather curtains softened into deep blue, then charcoal, then finally the grey that meant morning was coming. Passengers who had been dozing in that half-conscious state somewhere between sleep and waking began to stir. Heads lifted, eyes opened. The change in light registered even through closed eyelids, pulling people back toward fuller awareness. Someone drew back one of the curtains. Cold air rushed in through the gap, but no one protested. The need to see outweighed the loss of warmth. The landscape revealed itself in shades of white and grey, snow-covered fields, bare trees, the road ahead marked by the tracks of earlier coaches and wagons. Dawn in winter arrived without fanfare, no brilliant sunrise, just a slow transition from darkness to dim light. The sun still below the horizon, but its approach evident in the gradual illumination of the frozen world. The psychological shift was immediate. The endless night was ending. The journey, or at least this leg of it, was approaching its conclusion. Passengers sat straighter. Conversations resumed after hours of silence. Bodies that had slumped into whatever position offered the least discomfort now attempted to reassemble themselves into something resembling normal posture. It was painful. Legs had been bent at awkward angles for so long that straightening them brought sharp protests from muscles and joints. Backs had curved and compressed. Necks had stiffened at odd angles. The simple act of sitting upright required genuine effort. Passengers began the futile attempt to make themselves presentable. Men ran hands through flattened hair. Women adjusted bonnets that had shifted during the night, tried to smooth wrinkled skirts, retied scarves. Everyone was dishevelled. Everyone knew it. But the approaching destination demanded at least the gesture toward normal appearance. Belongings were gathered. Blankets were folded, though not with any precision. Foot warmers, long since cold, were collected. The small items that had shifted and scattered during hours of motion were located and returned to pockets and bags. The driver called down through the roof. An update on their progress, recognition of landmarks. Perhaps 20 minutes to the next town, perhaps 30. The familiar anxiety returned, the need to be ready, to not delay the coach, to manage the transition from this compressed, intimate space back into the world of separation and propriety. And something else emerged too, something unexpected, a kind of sadness. These people, strangers just days ago, had shared something profound, not pleasant, not chosen, but deeply human. They had endured together, suffered together, kept each other warm through the coldest hours, maintained patience when everything in them wanted to complain or protest or simply break down. Now they would separate and likely never see each other again. The coach slowed, then stopped. The sudden stillness felt wrong. After so many hours, days of constant motion, the absence of movement registered as an almost physical shock. Bodies still expected the rocking. Minds still anticipated the sway. The driver climbed down. His boots hit the frozen ground with sounds that seemed too loud after the muffled acoustics of travel. He opened the door. Cold morning air flooded in, sharp, clean, painful in its freshness after the stale warmth of too many bodies in too small a space. "End of the line," he said. Getting out proved harder than anyone expected. Legs wouldn't cooperate. They had been bent, compressed, wedged against other legs for so long that they seemed to have forgotten their proper function. Passengers had to brace themselves against the doorframe, lower themselves carefully, test whether their legs would actually support their weight. They wobbled. Standing on solid, unmoving ground felt strange. The world seemed to tilt and shift even though it was perfectly still. Equilibrium calibrated to constant motion struggled to adjust to motionlessness. One passenger took several steps and nearly fell. The sensation of still moving persisted even while standing in place. The body remembered the rocking, expected it, compensated for movement that was no longer happening. Fellow travellers helped each other down, hands extended, elbows steadied. The same careful attention they'd shown each other in the confined space now continued in these first moments of separation. Luggage was unloaded from the boot. Bags and trunks that had been secured with leather straps were freed and set on the ground. Passengers claimed their belongings with numb fingers, movements slow and clumsy. The farewells were brief, polite, almost formal. Safe travels. Thank you for your kindness. Good fortune to you. People who had leaned against each other for warmth, who had shared blankets and food, and the intimate ordeal of days without proper rest, now spoke with the careful distance of strangers. The intensity of the shared experience seemed to demand this, a return to normal social boundaries as quickly as possible. They dispersed, some toward lodgings to finally sleep in actual beds, some to waiting family or business associates, some directly to whatever purpose had driven them to make such a journey in such a season. The physical aftermath revealed itself slowly. Walking hurt. Muscles that had been immobile for so long protested every movement. Backs ached, shoulders were stiff, hips felt locked in place. The body had moulded itself to the confined space and now had to remember its full range of motion. Fingers and toes protected, but never truly warm during the journey, burned as they returned to life in heated rooms. The painful tingling of frost-bitten extremities, that particular sharp discomfort that came with circulation, returning to half-frozen flesh. And the exhaustion, deep, complete. The kind that came not just from lack of sleep, but from days of constant tension, constant discomfort, constant cold. Yet beneath it ran a strange current of wired alertness. Bodies too tired to function properly, but minds too stimulated by the ordeal to simply shut down. The paradox of being simultaneously desperate for rest and unable to fully relax. The journey ended, but the memory of it did not fade quickly. In letters written days later, once hands had warmed enough to hold a pen steadily, Travellers described the experience in detail. They wrote of the cold that seemed to have settled into their bones, of nights that stretched impossibly long, of the strange half-sleep that was all the motion allowed. The accounts were matter-of-fact, not dramatic. This happened, then this, then this. The ordeal needed no embellishment. Many made a private vow, never again in winter, never again would they climb into that dark interior, knowing what awaited. Never again would they trust their comfort to leather curtains and wool blankets against January wind. And yet many did travel again. Business required it, family required it. The same urgent matters that had compelled the first journey would compel another. The vow faded. Memory softened the edges of discomfort just enough. What remained was the story. Among friends, at dinner tables, in quieter moments, the winter journey became something to recount. Not with pride exactly, but with a kind of recognition. I endured this. I know what that was. The telling became its own small badge, proof of having lived through something genuinely difficult and emerged intact. There was acknowledgment even then that this could not last. The stagecoach winter journey represented something both remarkable and temporary. Roads improved, technology advanced. Already there was talk of railroads, of steam power, of travel that would not require such suffering. Within a generation, these frozen journeys would become obsolete, remembered only by those who had lived them. What these winter passages revealed, perhaps more than anything, was human adaptability. The cold was real. The discomfort was genuine. The sleeplessness wore on body and mind, and yet people endured it, not through heroism or exceptional strength, but through simple necessity. The journey had to be made, so it was made. The body adjusted. The mind found ways to drift. Hours passed because hours always pass. In that cramped interior pressed against strangers, something unexpected emerged. Intimacy, forced by circumstance, shared blankets, shared silence, the unspoken understanding that all suffered equally. Social boundaries that seemed immovable in normal life became meaningless when everyone was equally cold, equally exhausted, equally desperate for the journey to end. Extraordinary discomfort transformed into accepted routine because there was no alternative. When everyone travelling faced the same conditions, the conditions stopped being extraordinary. They simply were. This is what travel meant. This is what winter required. Acceptance came not from courage, but from the absence of other options. Once railroads arrived, once heated cars and smoother rails replaced the stagecoach, the memory of these journeys took on a strange quality. Former passengers, now older, found themselves looking back with something almost like nostalgia, not for the suffering itself, but for having survived it, for the clarity that comes from enduring something difficult. For a time when connection between distant places required genuine sacrifice, the stagecoach disappeared, the winter roads grew quiet, and the last generation to remember those frozen journeys carried the knowledge into an age that could barely imagine such a world. The last generation to remember these journeys firsthand lived into the 1890s, perhaps even the early 1900s. They would have been children or young adults in the 1840s and 50s, old enough to recall the sensation clearly. By then they rode trains through the same landscapes in heated cars, arriving in hours rather than days. When they told younger people about winter stagecoach travel, the days of enduring cold and sleeplessness and constant motion, those listeners could barely imagine such a world. The telling itself must have felt strange, describing something that had been completely ordinary, accepted without question, now transformed into something almost unbelievable. The winter stagecoach journey remains a testament to what people will endure when connection matters more than comfort, and to how quickly even the most vivid hardships fade once better options emerge.